Hello Story Store listeners. Before we start this interesting story, please subscribe this channel, Story Store, and hit the bell icon. Thank you. Now here we go. The morning air bit at my fingertips as I stepped into the wedding venue, a modern glass-walled hall nestled in the rolling hills outside Spokane. The chill wasn't just from the Washington dawn. It was in the way my son, Caleb, glanced at me as I entered alone. No embrace, no spark of warmth, just a curt nod, as if I were a guest who'd wandered in from a neighboring event without an invitation. I'd spent the previous night pressing my emerald green dress, the one my late husband, Daniel, always said made me look like I could weather any storm. I told myself today would be different, that Caleb would see me not just as his mother, but as the woman who'd carved out his path in life. I had no inkling that by the end of the day, everything I thought I knew about my role in his world would unravel. Not in a dramatic crash, but in the quiet absence of my name being spoken. The venue was breathtaking floor-to-ceiling windows, framing the misty hills, wildflowers in soft purples and whites lining the aisle, and lighting that glowed like a late summer evening. But the beauty felt distant, almost sterile, as I arrived. No one from Caleb's side met me at the entrance. It was his fiancée, Abigail's younger sister, who ushered me to a seat in the back row, far from the family table, no ribbon or corsage to mark me as the mother of the groom. I smoothed my dress, folded my hands, and braced my heart. I'd prepared a short speech for the rehearsal dinner, something to honor Caleb and his father's memory. But the microphone passed from Abigail's father to her brother, then to a pair of their old college friends, as if Caleb's childhood, my years of raising him, had never happened. The silence wasn't just in the room. It was in the way people's eyes slid past me, unsure why I was there at all. Maybe Caleb wasn't sure either at one point. Abigail's mother brushed past my chair, her hand grazing my shoulder, not with kindness, but with the fleeting touch you'd offer a stranger out of obligation. I'd baked Caleb's favorite cranberry scones the night before, carefully packed in a linen-lined basket, but they sat untouched on the chair beside me all evening. No one noticed, and I couldn't find the courage to offer them. The moment never came. Watching Caleb dance with Abigail, their faces glowing with youth and certainty, I felt like I was looking through a window at a life I no longer belonged to. When I stepped outside to call a ride home, the wind carried a weight heavier than the cold, as if it knew something in me had shifted. Have you ever stood at your own child's celebration and felt more invisible than the staff stacking plates? Let me tell you, it doesn't cut like a knife. It settles, slow and quiet, like dust on a forgotten shelf. That was the moment the real story began. The next morning, I woke still wearing the pearl studs I'd chosen for the wedding, the ones Caleb used to fidget with during Sunday services when he was small. I left them in, maybe out of habit, maybe because removing them felt like admitting the day before was real. By afternoon, I checked my phone. No message from Caleb. No thank you, no follow-up. But there was a photo online, posted to a wedding album, Abigail's family beaming, their friends perfectly framed, Caleb standing tall in the center, as if he'd always been part of their world. I scanned every face. I wasn't there. I hadn't even known the picture was taken. That evening, a plain envelope slipped through the mail slot of my small apartment. No return address, but the handwriting was Caleb's, neat, deliberate, unmistakable. Inside was a folded card with a dinner invitation, written in a tone so formal it could have come from a corporate assistant. He and Abigail wanted to take me out. They had something to share. No warmth, no mention of love or gratitude, just a date, time, and place. I stared at the words for hours, tracing the letters, searching for something that wasn't there. But I went. The restaurant was one of those places that looked rustic: exposed beams, mason jar glasses, but charged prices that could buy a week's groceries. The host greeted Caleb and Abigail like old friends. Abigail was already seated, cradling a glass of sparkling water with an air of importance. Caleb stood as I approached, kissed my cheek lightly, and sat without offering to pull out my chair. We ordered small plates, fancy names, like foraged mushroom tart and heritage. Beet salad that felt foreign on my tongue. I barely ate. Caleb did most of the talking, launching into a speech about the changing world, sustainable land use, and their grand vision. He and Abigail wanted to build an ecolodge, a haven for mindfulness and connection. Then he slid a folder across the table, glossy professional, with charts, timelines, and a signature page at the back. My name was printed neatly under the line. He smiled, said the property would be managed in my name, just for paperwork, to streamline things. Abigail nodded, her voice smooth as she spoke of legacy, of building something lasting together. But her eyes stayed on the folder, not me. I didn't agree. I didn't refuse. I just sat there, listening to my son's polished words, so unlike the boy who used to ask me about constellations. The waitress refilled my water glass. I watched the ice float, cold and clear, melting into nothing, just like everything else. That evening, the next morning, I tucked the folder under a pile of unopened seed catalogs in my kitchen. The envelope from Caleb stayed unopened beside it. The apartment was quiet, save for the hum of the fridge and the faint creak of the radiator waking up. I sat at the table, sipping coffee that had gone cold, staring at the wall. No decision had been made. Caleb hadn't called, and I hadn't reached out. But something had shifted, not in the folder. Not in him, but in me. That afternoon, I walked to clear my thoughts and ended up at the old grain store downtown. They had seed packets displayed out front, bright packets promising zinnias and sunflowers. It took me back to the early days, before the distance, before the silence, when Caleb would chase dragonflies through the fields while Daniel hauled grain sacks. He'd ask me the names of wildflowers, and I always had an answer. I went home, sat on the edge of my bed, and unhooked the small brass key from the chain around my neck. It belonged to the lock on our family's storage barn, out on the 1,200-acre property Daniel had loved. He'd called it a place for things that mattered. I hadn't been back since his funeral. The drive to the property took an hour the next morning. The land was unchanged golden grass, swaying under a gray sky, the air sharp with the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. I parked by the gate and walked the rest of the way in boots I hadn't worn in years. The barn's lock clicked open, the door groaning like it was relieved to breathe again. Inside, it smelled of dust and old leather. I'd forgotten how much we'd stored here: faded ribbons from state fairs, tax records, a box of Daniels, handwritten notes. In the back, under a tarp, was a metal file box, heavy and sealed. The key still worked. Inside were photos, yellowed letters, and a document sleeve labeled in Daniel's steady hand, "For Eleanor only." I opened it carefully. There was the deed to the entire 1,200 acres, transferred to me alone 7 years before Daniel died. No liens, no coners, just my name, clear and legal. There was also a letter, short and direct, in the same pen he used for important things. He wrote that he'd seen how Caleb viewed the land, not with love, but with ambition. He hoped Caleb would grow into a man who asked before taking, but if he didn't, this was my way out, my right to say no. I sat on the barn floor for hours, the deed in my lap, the wind rattling the tin roof. I didn't cry or speak. I just breathed, feeling the weight of something that was truly mine for the first time in years. 2 days later, I drove back to the city, windows down, the cold air sharp against my skin. I didn't play the radio. I needed the quiet. The night before, I'd spread out every document from the box deed, letter, tax records, A notarized statement from Daniel's lawyer confirming the transfer. Every page was dated, airtight, leaving no room for doubt. I gathered them into a plain folder, not as a weapon, but as proof. For the first time, I realized I needed that more than I needed Caleb's approval. I made an appointment with Margaret, a lawyer I'd known for decades, the kind who didn't ask questions I couldn't answer. Her office was in a brick building, downtown, with a bell that jingled when you opened the door, and a photo of her family's orchard on the wall. She read the documents in silence, her glasses perched on her nose. When she finished, she tapped the folder and asked, "What do you want to protect first, the land or yourself?" I said both, so we set up a trust. It wasn't dramatic, just a notary, a few clauses, and a legal shield, ensuring no one could touch the land unless I was incapacitated, confirmed by 2 independent doctors. Margaret added safeguard zolts for deed filings, a lawyer in Coeur d'Alene to handle correspondence, a clause blocking Caleb or Abigail from using my name in any business dealings. It took 3 days. I didn't tell Caleb, I didn't mention it in our family text thread. I just kept the folder on a high shelf in my closet, not hidden, not displayed, just there. When Caleb called next, his voice was bright, saying he and Abigail wanted to take me out again to show me new plans. I said I'd check my schedule, hung up, and stood by the closet, staring at the folder. I wasn't afraid or empowered, just ready. The restaurant was the same barn aesthetic, overpriced wine, polished tables. Caleb and Abigail stood as I arrived, their smiles practiced. Abigail wore a cream-colored dress that looked like it cost more than my monthly rent. Caleb's jacket was new, tailored, but slightly too small, like he was trying to be someone bigger. They hugged me lightly, said it was good to see me. I nodded, sat, and smoothed my napkin with the same care I'd once used to fold Caleb's. School clothes. The menus were closed. Caleb leaned forward, saying he had something exciting. Out came a sleek portfolio, black with silver lettering. Abigail opened it, revealing renderings of an Ecolodge glass pavilions, yoga decks, trails winding through pines. They called it Willow Haven. Abigail spoke with precision, citing revenue projections and guest demographics. Caleb added childhood anecdotes, weaving them into the pitch. It was smooth, rehearsed, and not for me. They were selling a deal, not sharing a dream. The final page had my name printed below a signature line. Caleb smiled, said it was almost ready, just needed my blessing. I didn't speak. Instead, I pulled out my plain manila envelope and slid it across the table. Caleb's smile faltered. Abigail's stayed frozen. Inside was a copy of the trust, its terms clear and unyielding. Caleb read every page, his jaw tightening. Abigail's composure cracked, a crease forming between her brows. The final clause requiring medical verification for any transfer of control made Caleb exhale sharply. "So that's that," he said, hands folded on the table. Abigail said nothing. I nodded, gathered my napkin, and stood. "I'm driving myself home," I said. Outside, the air was sharp, the street quiet. I started my car and let the silence settle around me like a familiar coat, one that finally fit. The next morning, I made chamomile tea instead of coffee, something gentler. I didn't check my phone or turn on the TV. I sat in the kitchen, listening to the kettle's soft whistle fade. The night before lingered, not like a storm, but like soil turned over, ready for something new. By afternoon, I checked my phone. One message, no name, but I knew it was Caleb. "You made things more difficult than they needed to be." No anger, no apology, just entitlement, as if my role was to smooth his path. I set the phone down. Later, I rummaged through the hall closet, past scarves and gloves, and found a set of keys tied with a faded blue ribbon. One opened the cabin on the far end of the property, unused since Daniel's last healthy Thanksgiving. I drove out the next day. The road was rough, overgrown with brambles, but the cabin stood firm, its cedar siding weathered but intact. Inside, dust danced in the sunlight. I opened drawers, finding a half-used sketchpad, a jar of dried sage, a wool sweater folded in a crate. The cabin needed work cleaning, a new coat of paint, but it felt right. Nothing like the glossy lodge in Caleb's plans. I swept the floors that afternoon, the broom's rhythm steady against the wood. By dusk, I sat on the porch, watching the light fade over the hills. No cars, no messages, just the wind through the pines. I'd said what I needed to, not with words, but with choices. Caleb would move on, or he wouldn't. For once, I wasn't building for him. The land was mine, and so was the peace it brought. The days that followed were slow, deliberate. I spent mornings airing out the cabin, afternoons walking trails I hadn't touched in years. The air carried the scent of wet earth and fading summer. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd almost lost. One evening, cleaning out chipped ceramic mugs, my phone buzzed. It was Caleb, saying the bank had frozen a credit line tied to a land appraisal, mentioning confusion. He hoped we could talk. I didn't reply. The next day, a voicemail came. His voice clipped, careful, dancing around my health, the drive, never asking how I was. I deleted it. That night, I stood on the porch, a blanket around my shoulders, the trees swaying in the dark. I thought about all the times I'd made things easier, stepped aside, smiled when I should have spoken. This was different. I started writing in an old notebook I found in a drawer. Not for anyone, just for me. I wrote about the silence in Caleb's voice, the trust I'd thought unbreakable, now reduced to legal clauses. I wrote about letting go of waiting. The pages went into the envelope with the deed, not as proof, but as a record. Another message came days later. If this is really what you want, then I guess we're done here. I didn't respond. I walked to the clearing behind the cabin. Watching the branches sway, the sky burning gold as the sun set. I spent the next week fixing the cabin, tightening the porch railing, clearing the chimney, sealing a whistling window. The work was small, but grounding, my hands aching in a way that felt honest. I trimmed the blackberry bushes by the fence, their thorns leaving fine scratches on my arms, like the land's way of claiming me back. One afternoon, I checked the old greenhouse. Its glass was cracked, but sturdy, moss creeping along the shelves. I opened the vents, letting the air sweep through. That night, I lit the fireplace, the wood popping as the room filled with the scent of cedar. I sat with a mug of hot water, listening to the wind. The next day, I unpacked a box I'd brought photos, a quilt, a recipe card in my mother's hand, and a packet of wildflower seeds Caleb gave me when he was 10. I planted them in the clearing, pressing them into the soil with my hands. No words, just quiet. I set a chair in the yard, watching the cabin, the shed, the garden. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. The light shifted, birds flitted through. And I wasn't waiting for anyone. Something in me was unfolding, like a lock finally turning dot. It started with Clara from the library, a woman in a corduroy coat with a bag of seed catalogs and poetry books. We'd nodded at each other in town, but one day she stopped me by the bulletin board, asking if I'd join a gardening group. I hesitated, but took the flyer. The group met bi-weekly in the library's back room. Women, mostly older, some widowed, some alone, all tired of fading away. I went, sitting quietly at first, listening to stories of lost husbands, grown children, lives that didn't fit anymore. When I spoke, I kept it simple. I had a ranch, a son, and a quiet I was learning to need. Clara handed me a slice of bread without a word. By the third meeting, I brought rosemary from the garden, a pair of gloves for a woman with arthritic hands, A rhubarb pie I hadn't made in years. We didn't define ourselves by roles, just women with stories too long to tell. Clara suggested I teach a workshop simple things, like growing mint or preserving herbs. I cleaned out the cabin's shed, hung old tools, and told Clara, who told the rest. 3 women came the first day. We made stew, talked about compost, sat on the porch with mugs. I wasn't a teacher. I was someone remembering how to belong, late. October brought Caleb to the cabin, unannounced. His car crunched the gravel, the door slamming too hard. I was washing jars in the shed, taking my time to dry my hands and walk out. He stood in the clearing, hands in pockets, eyes scanning like he was choosing who to be. We didn't speak at first. Then he said things were tough. The lodge financing had collapsed. Abigail was with her parents. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. He said he'd made mistakes, then blamed Minot for the trust, but for how he turned out. For teaching him love meant endless giving. That family meant shielding him from consequences. I looked at him, a man carrying a version of himself he didn't recognize. I said I'd done my best, that I'd protected him too long, that my mistake was hiding disappointment from him. He paced, raised his voice, said I was rewriting history. I stood still, saying the land demanded truth, that it remembered every step, even his. He didn't argue after that. He looked at the cabin, the garden, the shed, seeing the gap between his plans and reality. He asked if I needed anything for winter. I said I was fine. He nodded, got in his car, and drove off. I watched until the sound faded, then went inside. There was no victory, just stillness, and that was enough. The first frost came early, icing the garden beds, sharpening the air. I moved slowly, not from age, but from a sense of earned calm. I wrote in the notebook, addressing the woman I'd been, the one who thought love meant erasing herself. I told her she'd done her best, but deserved better, that wanting to be seen wasn't weak, that her worth didn't need applause. I folded the letter into the envelope with the deed, next to old photos and a pressed daisy from the first garden Daniel and I planted. I made tea, lit the fire, and sat at the table. The stillness, not lonely but steady. The wind rattled the windows. A few leaves clinging to the trees, golden and stubborn. I didn't try to fix them. The morning light spilled across the floor, the frost melting patch by patch. I stood on the porch, barefoot in a sweater, watching the seasons shift. No one called, no one came, and I didn't mind. I'd stopped circling dates on a calendar, but I knew what day it was the first year I'd stopped asking permission to be. The wind smelled of pine and earth. I closed my eyes, hearing birds in the distance, my own breath steady. I wasn't waiting for apologies or reconciliations. I was on my land, in my time, my rhythm. The woman who'd been a wife, a mother, a shadow, now belonged to herself. And that was enough. If you've ever felt yourself fading into the background of your own life, I hope this story reminded you that you deserve to be seen, to stand firm. Where are you watching this from? Share your thoughts below. What part of this story spoke to you, and why? If it resonated, hit that subscribe button for